All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Sounds like a couple folks might still be lingering outside, but we're on a tight schedule. We have about an hour. So I'd like to welcome everybody to the American Eel Management Board. My name is Marty Gary from the Potomac River Fisheries Commission. I'll be your chairman. Your vice chairman is Lynn Fegley from Maryland. Seated to my right in a minute or two will be Kirby Roots Murdy, who is the Senior Fishery Management Plan Coordinator for this species, and Kristen Onstead, who is our stock assessment scientist that works with American eels. So our first item on the agenda is approval of the agenda. Are there any changes, additions, modifications to the agenda? Seeing none, it is approved. Second item on the agenda, approval of proceedings from the October 2018 meeting. Are there any changes, any corrections with the agenda or with the proceedings from October 2018? Seeing none, we have approved those proceedings. Next up is public comment. Kirby, do we have anybody that signed up?
Yes.
Okay. So we are on a tight schedule. We have one person who has signed up. Desmond Kahn, if you could come up to the public microphone, and if you could limit Desmond to about 2 minutes or so, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Real quickly, I just wanted to alert the Management Board to some new research on American eels, which I published this spring in the journal Fisheries. And this concerns some new data on trends in abundance and fishing mortality of American eels. And I was inspired to pursue this research by a comment made by Craig Pugh, one of the Delaware commissioners. What I did was use a source of data that the stock assessment did not use in the last assessment, and that is a source of data that is used for many assessments, and that is the Marine Recreational Information Program, or MRIP, data on catches and trips. So what I did was construct a mean catch per trip index of relative abundance for American eels, and I used the whole Atlantic coast. So this is a very broad coverage index, and one thing you learn when looking at this is that most eels that are caught by the recreational fishery are discarded by the fishermen. So they're primarily, it seems to be a bycatch, and the majority are discarded. But for purposes of estimating abundance, we've always used the total catch, including discards. And this data is used for the striped bass assessment, the weakfish assessment, the bluefish assessment, and probably some other species. And what it shows is that while American eel, for the period of 1981 to 2014, their peak abundance was in 1981. They did go into a steep decline till about 95, but ever since 2003, their trend in abundance has been increasing. And they've increased as of 2014 up to the point where they're back up to half the level they were in 81, which is the peak during that period. So I just wanted to inform the board, and there are various comments on the stock assessment, so I hope this could contribute to future assessments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Desmond. Appreciate your comments. Next up on our agenda, we're going to have an update from Kirby on the board working group recommendations for addressing a coast-wide cap overage. As most of you know, we have passed a while back Addendum 5 to the Fishery Management Plan, and there's a 2-year trigger in place. Kirby's going to go through this. There's a work group that's been formed. They've met several times. I've listened in on all of those meetings, and there's been a lot of work, and we have a little bit to do. But Kirby, can you present the work?
Yep. Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's a very quick presentation because it's just an update. So for everyone's information, we have a work group. The membership I have up on the screen now, it includes Marty Gary, For the state of Maine, Pat Kelleher has designated Megan Ware to take part in this group. Shree Patterson from New Hampshire, Lynn Fagley from Maryland, John Clark from Delaware, Pat Gear with Virginia, Chris Badsavage with North Carolina, and Ross Self from South Carolina. So, as Marty laid out, Addendum 5, which was approved a year ago this month, implements a new coastwide cap of 916,473 pounds. There's also a new management trigger as part of this addendum. So moving forward, a 10% overage, which is greater than 1.008 million pounds for 2 consecutive years, triggers management action. And when it comes to that management action, previously there had been state-by-state allocations in which the states would be responsible for their quota. But currently, under the new addendum, there is no allocation. So states that are harvesting 1% of that coastwide harvest are responsible for the reduction if that management trigger is tripped. And the working group has met over the last year a number of times to develop basically a policy on how that reduction strategy would be carried out. So there's 2 main challenges that the work group has focused on during their meetings over the last year. The first being that if the coastwide cap is exceeded, there is this marginal difference between it being exceeded and hitting that management trigger. So you can go up to just shy of 10% of an overage annually without there being any management action that's required. The second that we've talked about at this board before is the lag time in which data becomes available for us to know if we have gone over the coastwide cap or if a management trigger has been tripped. So we often get data for the previous fishing year, usually between the late spring through the summer. And so we're in the current fishing season in which we would be wanting to effectively take action to reduce harvest if need be. And so there's a 1-year lag in terms of trying to get action to address an overage. So these are 2 of the main challenges the group has struggled with and has talked through. The draft document is continuing to be worked on. And the group has thought through a number of overage scenarios and reduction strategies, and we'll be fleshing those out over the next few calls. So the next step is for this work group to meet again later this month and to continue work in developing this document and for it to be presented to the board at the annual meeting. The previous plan had been to present a draft document to you all today, but given some additional discussions by the group, it was determined that it'd be best for the document to be fleshed out a little bit more with a decision tree to really address some of these scenarios where the management trigger has not been tripped, but an overage has occurred of the coastwide cap, and how best to try to address that to prevent that management trigger from being tripped. So with that, I'll take any questions. Thank you very much.
So there's no action or motions needed by the board today, but if there's any questions about the work group's efforts, Kirby can take those now. Are there any questions for Kirby? Okay. And I just want to again thank all the members of the work group. I think we have good broad representation from both some of the lower harvesting states on both ends of the geographic spectrum up and down the coast, as well as the Chesapeake region where a lot of the higher landings of yellow eels occur. There's been a lot of effort that's been put into those meetings, and we'll have information for you at the October annual meeting. Next up on the agenda will be the review and consideration of approval for 2020 aquaculture proposals, and we have 2. Kirby?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So for my presentation today, I'll go through the Maine proposal, then the North Carolina proposal, the technical committee's review of those 2 proposals, law enforcement committee's feedback, and I'll take any questions from you all. So first, the technical committee was presented Maine's summary of the 2019 fishing year earlier this summer. And effectively, Maine harvested 130 pounds of their 200-pound allocation to grow out glass eels to the yellow eel life stage. So American Unagi is the company that's working in Maine on this aquaculture allocation, and they contracted with several commercial eel fishermen, all that work together to help make this program run smoothly this year. Each fisherman had between a 10 to 20 pound allocation to fish their fyke nets and took their catch to buying stations with a swipe card system as required by Maine Department of Marine Resources. It was a slow start to the season due to the cold spring in the region, and most of the fishing took place from mid-April through May. American Unagi, as I said, harvested only 130 pounds of their 200 allocation, and this was a decision made by the facility to try not and stress the capacity they have in the facility for growing out these animals. And for the first year of this allocation, they wanted to ensure that they were more successful rather than trying to harvest all the way up to their allocation. Law enforcement visited the facility and had no issues with the program. And in terms of their proposal for the upcoming year, 2020, there's no changes in the facility or monitoring, and they plan to try to harvest the full 200 pounds. For North Carolina, we received a summary of their 2019 fishing season. Todd Mathis presented an update on on this year's fishing season, as well as their 2-year proposal for the American Eel Farm that has submitted a proposal annually since about 2016. So the American Eel Farm fishermen fished fyke nets about 14 of 22 possible weeks, primarily from January 1st through March 30th, ending about 6 weeks earlier than they had set their season. Dip nets were only used on one occasion, and fishing primarily occurred in canals and tributaries of the Lake Mattamuskeet area. In total, 13.82 pounds of glass eels, which is approximately 42,000 eels, were harvested, and approximately 980 of them were released alive. Catch per unit data was collected, but some of the caveats included differences in net dimensions, changing harvest locations, gear modifications, inconsistent fishing effort, periods of no fishing, and recorded weights that included water. So in terms of the changes that they're proposing, they're putting forward another 2-year proposal. The first change is that they are interested in moving the fishing year from starting on a calendar basis of January 1 to starting November 1st and going to March 31st. So it would cover 2 calendar years. They are also going to change the time in which they needed to leave the nets open from noon to 3 p.m. This was primarily to address the need to get to some of these sites that are further away from the facility, so ease of transportation to get there to address the nets. Other changes are a move to record the actual number of eels harvested or weight of glass eels harvested. Basically, previously they had been trying to measure the weight, but they hadn't been able to do it to a precise level, so the goal now is to record to the nearest 0.1 pounds of glass eels, and for any dip nets used. And there will be changes to the weekly CPUE reporting. They will be increasing that, and they will also now be required to call in to North Carolina DMF prior to leaving the site of what their total harvest was for that trip. So the technical committee reviewed both of these proposals last month, and regarding Maine's proposal, no concerns were raised. For North Carolina's proposal, there was a minority opinion concerning about moving the start date to November 1st. Basically, the concern stemmed from whether this would present any law enforcement issues. But overall, the technical committee indicated that this would likely not be an issue, and if anything, might provide more information about abundance in the fall. They were going off of, in terms of this interest in starting November 1st, American Eel Farm had heard from some South Carolina fishermen that there might be higher abundance in the fall than previously known, and they also were interested in looking at some of the Beaufort Bridge ichthyoplankton sampling program that seemed to indicate that there might be the presence of glass eels around that time as well. So the technical committee, their primary recommendations were that for future proposals to include more information on the attributes of the harvest locations, the specific amount of the previous year's harvest. Much of these proposals, when we've had the technical committee review them in a given year, have, as a supplement, offered up what their summary is, but the group is looking to have that just rolled in with their proposal for the next year. And then also to require CPUE reporting for each of the harvest sites. So, for example, North Carolina is doing this on theirs because they have only this one site where they're doing glass eel harvest, whereas for Maine currently, there is a CPUE that's calculated, but across all of the sites combined for the state. And so the technical committee was interested in moving more towards a CPUE value for each of those sites that are harvested as part of that glass eel aquaculture allocation. Overall, the technical committee recommended approval of both proposals. The law enforcement committee was also presented these proposals by email, notified of the changes, and they did not indicate any concern or objections to these proposals as presented. So with that, that concludes my presentation. I'll take any questions. Thank you.
Questions for Kirby on either of the two proposals?
You got Dan? Karen?
Go ahead, Dan.
Question about the call-in that the North Carolina fishermen do to the agency. Is it just dropping a message on somebody's voicemail, or is it something a little more sophisticated?
That's a good question, Dan. I might have to go to Chris Batsavage to give some more clarity on that.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Chairman. They call into our communications staff, who are the phones are monitored 24 hours a day, so they're actually talking to someone and not leaving a voice message.
Cherie Patterson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question has to do with, is there anything in the addendum that allows for the straddling of a calendar year in the quota?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So currently the language in the addendum references the allocation on an annual basis, but it doesn't have anything specific to calendar year versus fishing year.
Pat Gear.
Kirby, I don't know if this should go to the TC or to Chris in North Carolina, but looking at the North Carolina plan, they put a whole lot of effort. You know, it says 73 days with over 15,000 hours of fishing, and they only caught roughly 10 pounds of glass eels because they caught 3 pounds with dip nets. Did the TC discuss those numbers? I mean, there's a lot of effort going in for the little amount that they're harvesting.
Yeah, thank you, Pat. I think I failed to get into that detail about what they harvested in 2019. Looking back at my presentation, I had it up on the screen, but I didn't speak to it. So they harvested 13.82 pounds, which is the highest amount that they've harvested in the 3 years or so that they've put forward proposals. But unfortunately, they had a total mortality event on all of those eels that were harvested in June. I believe it was an issue with the feed. That's what was communicated to us on the call. So when the technical committee considered that change in terms of them increasing and having some more success this year, there was some notes about how adjusting the season may allow for them to have more success if they are possibly seeing eels in the fall. But again, that's anecdotal information from some fishermen in South Carolina. Right now, we don't have great data to demonstrate for sure whether or not they will be successful being able to harvest glass eels at that time of year.
I mean, because as a business model, it's going to be pretty hard, and 13 pounds is just not going to be. They're not going to make a profit with that little amount, even if they kept it alive.
Yeah, thanks, Pat. So I can't speak to the full business model that this aquaculture farm, American Eel Farm in North Carolina, is operating under, but I do believe they have other sales of eels at different life stages. So yellow eels, I believe they're selling them for bait, but I don't know the full extent of what their business is.
Thanks, Pat. Other questions for Kirby on either proposal? Eric Reed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, one of the things that TC is recommending is a CPUE. But if you look at the caveats, what's it really going to do unless you're calibrating every net and site and everything else? As far as a requirement goes, I don't know why that would even be in there. It seems a little confounding to me.
Yeah, so it's a fair observation that there are definitely caveats with how this data is collected. The technical committee didn't express any concerns about the CPUE data that was coming out of the North Carolina proposal currently. What they were looking to have more information on was regarding Maine's proposal, because currently, as I said, that CPUE data is aggregated at the state level. I mean, the harvest is broken down on a county basis, but it doesn't have the CPUE at the site level, whereas the North Carolina one, we only have information on a small number of sites, and so CPU is calculated on those, and that's where the technical committee was hoping to get more information for any proposal coming forward that has it specific to the site.
Follow, Eric?
Yeah, okay, thank you for that. I appreciate that. So if you look at, I have no problem with the North Carolina proposal, and Mr. Chairman, whenever you want a motion, I'll give you a motion. But what are the chances of, because two of their best weeks, not their best week, were right at the end of March. I mean, they only caught a pound and a half, or 5 pounds. Well, no, sorry, yeah, 5 pounds twice. But what's the likelihood of they don't catch any when they want to open up in November and December, and they catch a few halfway through March and say, hey, we're catching a few, we'd like to leave it open because we have 186 pounds left to be caught. It just seems to me they want to close the fishery when they were catching a few.
So I think something for this board to consider in reviewing these proposals and considering approval of them is if there are any specifications that you would prefer to have on that allocation. So one thing for this board to keep in mind is that these proposals have operated under generally a calendar year basis, right? So they've outlined when their season starts and ends, usually in January through late in the spring. The proposal has outlined their start date and their end date. It does straddle 2 different calendar years. There's no language currently about them looking to extend their season beyond the end of their season in March. So if that is of concern, then this board can make those stipulations known.
Pat Kelleher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'm having a little trouble. I'm trying to figure out why we would need to deal with CPUE when we're talking about a handful of harvesters in a few locations. How is that going to benefit management? There are so many factors that are going to impact CPUE outside of the control of the harvesters. I mean, somebody could put a net in front of that pike net. It could be weather-driven. There are some rivers don't fish as good one year as a river right beside it. So, it's unclear to me what benefit recording CPUE is going to be as it pertains to just the aquaculture harvest. I mean, if we're really looking for CPUE to benefit management, shouldn't we be talking about maybe a different approach as it pertains to the entire fishery, not just the aquaculture quota?
So again, this was just an observation made during the call, and the group was in agreement on recommending that, if possible, to collect this information at the sites.
Adam Nowalski.
I would be interested in hearing some feedback from the state that reviewed the proposal, from the TC, from staff. Given the mortality event that occurred last year, we essentially just threw away 42,000 eels. Done. Gone. No benefit from it. what's going on at the facility, what reviews in place to make sure this isn't going to happen again, that something similar isn't going to happen. I think we've got to question, do we have a wise use of this resource if this is what happened to the eels last year? I've got a real concern about that, and I'd like to hear some feedback from the state that reviewed the proposal or staff about what's in place, that this is going to have a better outcome in future years and this is a reasonable use of this resource.
Chris, are you comfortable commenting on that?
Thanks. Yeah, it's, I guess part of it is the timing of the mortality event. It occurred after the plan was submitted. Not that that would necessarily change our minds as far as bringing it forward. Yes, as Kirby mentioned, they actually had quite a bit more success in collecting glass eels this past year than they had in the last few. It was just unfortunate they didn't survive the tank rearing. I mean, in terms of inspection, our enforcement officers are going there to make sure that they're following what's laid out in the plan from a regulatory standpoint, not necessarily from. We don't evaluate them on whether or not they're going to be productive and profitable. We really don't do that for any of our permits. So, but it is. I mean, I think your point's well taken as far as the concern the board has as far as just the lack of success seeing these things through to the adult stage. But from our perspective, they're following the provisions of the plan. No enforcement issues. Not a huge burden on staff to monitor this this aquaculture plan. So with that, we don't really have any concerns with it. But your points are well taken. Thanks.
Other questions on the proposals? Or we can entertain a motion if there aren't. Cherie Patterson.
Yes, I'd like to move to approve the 2020 aquaculture proposals with the TC's recommendations and also following the addendum to harvest up to 200 pounds per calendar year, not fishing year.
Get that on the board. Do we have a second to this motion? Back here. I'm going to go ahead and read this in.
Just a quick clarification. So, as you're aware, one of the proposals was for 2 years. The North Carolina proposal is a 2-year program. So, can you just specify with this motion whether this is an approval of that proposal for 2 years or if it's for 1?
Yes, for 2 years.
So just to be clear, this will be for both Maine and the North Carolina proposal for 2 years.
Maine is just the one proposal.
This applies, this just... Go ahead, Kirby.
Yeah, so that's what we were just trying to clarify, that one of the proposals is for 2 years, right? That's the North Carolina proposal. Maine's proposal is just for 1 year. So the motion is clarifying that it's just approval of these proposals with one of them that will carry for 2 years.
So you want that wording, is what you're telling me? Because the proposals are indicating that Maine is 1 year and North Carolina is 2 years. So that's why we're...
one last clarification. Kirby, go ahead.
Sheree, I just want to be clear. So for the 2020 aquaculture proposal, as indicated, we already have a harvest that has occurred for North Carolina in 2019. So does this motion, can you clarify what it means for when North Carolina can begin their fishing season for this allocation?
Yes, North Carolina can proceed with their proposal for November 1st. However, they have already harvested slightly less than 14 pounds, so they can only harvest up to 200 each calendar year.
Senator Minor.
Thank you. When I was listening to the discussion earlier, I didn't hear much about the state of Maine's proposal. I did hear about the review of their proposal, and it didn't seem like there were any issues. I wonder if splitting this motion wouldn't be the cleanest way to do it, so that any of the nuances of the proposal for North Carolina could be handled through a separate motion rather than have it be done the way it's being done. I'd like to say also I have some concern about what occurred, and if there was a reoccurrence up to 200 pounds, that would be an even more significant concern. And so I wonder why we would be approving a 2-year proposal for North Carolina and not a 1-year proposal. So anyway, that was the reason for my request to consider a different motion.
Richie White.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Would we not have the ability to readdress these in a year if there was another episode? Another mortality episode. In other words, we would have the ability to undo the second year if there was some reason. So that's a question.
Kirby?
Yeah, again, I think this is for the board to specify if you guys want to make it contingent on how the first year plays out in terms of monitoring, performance of harvest, law enforcement review.
Follow up. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, short of having that in the motion, we would not then have the ability at the end of the first year, if there was an event, for us to take action. I guess Tony might be able to answer.
Tony.
Richie, I think we can ask for a review of how the fishing year went, just like we did, I think, a couple years ago. And if there's something that alarms the board, you can revoke the proposal for the second year. Or revoke the proposal, the allocation for the second year.
So it's the board's pleasure as to how we proceed with the existing motion or pull it back. Ray Kane.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So why don't we split this motion? I mean, Maine's going to come back next year with a report. And why don't we leave the two states independent of one another? Why not split this motion?
Is the maker of the motion amenable to that, Sheree? All right. So we're going to split the motion. Go ahead, Tony.
I guess it would just be good to say, is there any objection to split the motion? Because it is property of the board now, and so therefore...
So is there an objection to splitting the motion? Seeing none, we're going to proceed with a split of the motion. While we're putting this up, Sheree.
So, the first part of the motion, can you bring up the one prior to this? Pat, feel free to jump in. You're the second, too. Okay, so move to approve Maine's 2020 agriculture proposal with the TC's recommendations. That would be the first one. Maine's 2020 agriculture.
Just cut and paste is all it is.
Does that capture your motion, Cherie? And seconder, Pat?
And the North Carolina one would just be the same. Move to approve North Carolina's 2020 agriculture proposal with the TC's recommendation, because within the plan it says it's for 2 years. If you want to be more specific, we could say 2 years if you want, if that's pleasure of the board.
Pat, because we split the motion, we're going to hold off on that second half and just talk about this first and then get to North Carolina.
Our discussion, Justin Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a point of clarification, were there any TC recommendations relative to Maine's 2020 proposal? As in recommendations for changes or additions to the proposal?
Well, as mentioned, there was an interest in trying to collect CPUE at the harvest site location, as well as whether to including information on attributes of the harvest location. So I had it up on a previous slide. It's slide 6, the attributes of the harvest location, the previous year's harvest, as well as requiring CPUE reporting from each harvest site. So basically the technical committee is looking to try to get some more information about some of the information on each of these locations. And then, as I said before, in the actual report, or the proposal they're sending in, what the harvest was, because each year now we've received generally a summary after the fact in a memo or in the actual presentation and not the written proposal.
Doug Haymans.
Not that I see it in here, but wasn't there also some discussion about a grow out to yellow stage, yellow eel life stage?
Kirby, can you address that?
Sure. So last year the board specified that the 200-pound glass eel allocation was for glass eels to be grown out to the yellow eel life stage for Maine, because the language in Addendum 4 specifies that the eels can be grown out to the state's legal eel size. So for nearly all other states along the coast, that's 9 inches at least.
Did that answer your question, Doug? You have a follow?
Well, so since that's not part of that motion, does it need to be? And it wasn't in their proposal either. Does it need to be?
Yes, it needs to be specified in the motion if it's going to be the requirement to grow out the glass eels to the yellow life stage.
So is that the desire, is to require grow out to the yellow eel life stage?
Yeah, so as mentioned before, it was specified by the board at the board meeting last year, so it's the pleasure of this board. To be clear, that's just to make it absolutely transparent that the grow-out operation will be growing out these glass eels harvested to the yellow eel life stage, which American Unagi has indicated that's their plan, but the motion specified that because of the state regulatory language.
Cherie is the maker of the motion. Would you like to add that in?
Yeah, go ahead and add that in. Thank you.
I think that achieves what you were asking, Doug. Thank you. Emerson Hasbrook.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'm a little unclear here. So we needed to include that language for Maine. Why is it that we do not need to include that language for North Carolina?
So as indicated, all other states, including North Carolina, their legal eel size is 9 inches, right? That's been determined by the technical committee to be the recommended yellow eel stage that these eels can be harvested at. So Maine currently has language that allows for the harvest of less than 9-inch eels. And so this is to specify that the grow out of those eels in Maine would be at the yellow eel stage. North Carolina already has a minimum size on what those eels would be caught and in turn sold at.
Follow, Emerson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So then it's implicit that for North Carolina, they need to raise those eels to the state's minimum size, and then I've got to follow up on that.
Yes.
So what happens when they all die? They didn't raise them to the minimum size. Does that put them in conflict with with our program that allows this to occur?
I don't believe so, because they all died.
I don't think they went to market, Emerson. I think that's the point, but I understand what you're saying. Chris Bat-Savage.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to clarify the question Emerson had, Marine Patrol collected the dead glass eels after it was reported that they died, so they're in our possession. Thanks.
Thank you, Chris. Other questions? All right, so are we ready to go ahead and vote on this motion? So we're going to take these one at a time, Kirby. So this is the main proposal. All those in favor, raise your hand. Those opposed? Any abstentions? Any null votes? Motion passes 17-0-0. Now we'll move to the next proposal. Go ahead, Pat.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Move to approve North Carolina's 2020 through 21 aquaculture proposal. So that's 2020 through 2021. Aquaculture proposal with the TC's recommendation. And the eels harvested will be grown out to the yellow eel life stage, minimum 9 inches.
All right, we have a motion by Pat Gear. Do we have a second to that motion? Cherie Patterson.
Thank you. We're trying to add in the
Minimum size.
the calendar year
Sorry, Tony.
provision.
So Marty, you split the motion, so it's not a new motion, it's still Cherie and Pat's motion. It's okay as long as Cherie is okay with adding that additional language about eel being harvested to the yellow eel life stage. But in order to keep us in the rules of Robert's order, we would keep it. Yeah, thank you for putting Cherie in there as the maker, and the seconder would still be Pat.
So the maker stays Cherie Patterson, second Pat Gear. Do we have the motion as you intended, Cherie?
Can we add in there to have an annual review?
Pat Gear.
And since the other one had specifically said the size, after eel life stage, yellow eel life stage, put in parentheses, minimum 9 inches.
Bob.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick question. So North Carolina is interested in starting their harvest November 1st. So if they started harvesting eels November 1st of this calendar year, of 2019, are those eels counted against the 186 pounds they have remaining on their current proposal and approval, or are they sort of starting their 2020 200-pound allocation? I think the answer is they're part of the 186 that they have left over, but I think we need to make that very clear that they can, harvest the remainder of their quota in this calendar year, 2019, and they start a new 200 pounds January 1st, 2020. But that's my interpretation, but I think we should make sure that's everybody around the board agrees with that.
Okay, you can see a lot of nodding heads. That's your intent, Cherie. So.
Yes, that was my intent. Pat, is that your intent?
I agree.
Pat Kelleher.
So, in a sense, this is a 3-year proposal. If we're going to expand on 2019 and then allow for potential harvest in 2020 and 2021, it's now a 3-year proposal, which goes, because you're allowing them to harvest. So it goes away from the existing even their existing proposal. We've expanded upon it as a board. Just if that's the way the board goes, I'm not going to object. But it certainly, I think they've got challenges in North Carolina associated with this proposal that have been raised. I'd like to see them succeed, but I am cautious. I would want to be cautious about wanting to expand this too much more.
Thank you, Pat. Senator Minor.
Thank you. And to the point about 2019 being, I guess, the current allocation that we're in, is there any disagreement with Pat's statement that that allocation currently exists and could still be fished on? I think you were saying in November as part of this year's allocation. This would add 2 more years to that, and if that is true, I would propose an amendment to this that would make it for an additional year, 2020, as opposed to 2020 and 2021, and then have the review and see how it looks in 2020.
So, Senator Minor, are you amending the motion?
Yes, please, to just make it 2020.
(2019 to 2020)?
Well, I think I may not be correct, but I don't think we're actually amending the current calendar year that we're in. I don't remember what the original motion was for the year that we're in, but assuming that the motion was that there would be fishing available in 2019 calendar year up to 200 pounds, how they administer that in North Carolina is up to North Carolina. I assume they keep track from the spring season to the fall season. It just occurs there differently than it does in New England. So the 2020 would be one more year.
Cherie.
Considering that this is a 2-year proposal that's supposed to start in 2020, that's what it is. It's going to start in 2020, right? Yeah, they can't fish this year in November or December. This is a 2020 proposal.
Kirby can clarify.
So, Cherie, I'm sorry, I want to make sure we're getting this right for this motion. So you're saying that they can't start November 1st. They can start their fishery January 1, 2020. And they would be able to fish in 2020 after the season that they had laid out. So it would be January 1 through March 31st, but they could start again in November of later that year. That's what you're specifying. Okay.
I think we had Senator Mearmont. Do you still want the mic?
No, thank you. That was answered.
Roy Miller.
Mr. Chairman, the way I read this, and I have to assume that the attorney representing this company will read this motion carefully. As it reads to me, they can harvest 200 pounds per calendar year. That means they could harvest 400 pounds, as I read this. Was that our intent? By spanning the sampling period from November, spanning over into the new calendar year, it's confused things. When it says they can harvest up to 200 pounds per year, if you read that literally, that means they could take a total of 400 pounds. 200 pounds in 2020 and 200 pounds in 2021.
Chris, can you add some clarity?
I don't know. I'll try because it is admittedly there is a disconnect, with the calendar year under the addendum and the fishing year, which that this plan proposes. So when we looked at the plan, we talked about how to account for the harvest under the fishing year, but keeping in compliance with the calendar year. So the statement of when they've, and the other part I want to go back to is the aquaculture plan that they had in 2019 ended in May. So there is not a current aquaculture plan in place in North Carolina. If this one's approved, it will start, presumably it will start November 1st. So they start, hypothetically, they start November 1st. They can land up to 186 pounds of glass eels during the 2019 calendar year because they already landed 14 pounds. However, if they did land, so they land 186 in the following year, fishing year, since this is a 200-pound allocation per fishing year, they've been limited to 14 pounds. Then they'd have to wait until November and start fishing again. So it's going to be a little extra math on our part as far as making sure that they don't take more than 200 pounds of eels any given calendar year, which would be spanning 2 fishing years, and they don't take more than 200 pounds of eels during any given fishing year, which would be November through March. So kind of hard to explain on the fly, but this is something that staff has talked about and is considered, and due to the call-in mechanism in place in the plan, we feel like we can keep track of that and making sure that they don't go out of compliance.
Bob?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we've got ourselves in a little bit of a procedural spot. We've got a motion to amend without a second, and we've got a new, or we've got the main motion that has been perfected by staff, I think, to capture a lot of the conversation that's been going on, right following the motion to amend. So what staff has done is made sure it's clear that no fishing can take place at the end of this calendar year, and that the intent is for 2020 and 2021 to allow fishing consistent with the new proposal from North Carolina in the months that they proposed. So hopefully that's all captured in the motion that's up on the board. And if one way out maybe if there is no second to the motion to amend, then that one goes away, and then we'll need to reread the main motion into the record, and we can move forward from there. But I don't want to cut off debate or lobby for either side of this. I'm just sort of highlighting the kind of spot we're in procedurally.
We are running a little bit short on time, and so maybe consistent with what Bob mentioned, let's give the amendment by Senator Minor an opportunity. So we would need a second. If we don't get that second, as Bob mentioned, we pull this back. Is there a second to Senator Minor's motion? Ray Kane? Discussion again. We'll call the question. Move to amend to remove 2011. Motion by 2021, pardon. Motion by Senator Minor, seconded by Ray Kane. All those in favor, raise your hand, please. Those opposed? Abstentions? 1. Null votes. Motion passes 10-6-1. We're going to get this adjusted on the board. Just a moment. And then okay, so we're back to the motion. I'm going to read it into the record. Go ahead, Eric.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman. So what we're doing is we are not approving North Carolina's 2020 aquaculture proposal because they're proposing to go fishing in November and December. But we're going to go, so we're changing their fishing season in 2020 from January, February, March, and adding November and December. Is that correct? I mean, I just assume make a motion to accept the plan as it is and let it go. North Carolina says they can enforce it and it would save us, we're going to be up to 15,000 hours of horsing around with this and have our CPU pretty crappy here before this is over. So I don't know why we're picking away at that. Let them do what they want. It's their money. Richie. And North Carolina can handle the enforcement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to hear the intent of the maker of the motion to amend. So is your intent that North Carolina will have the chance at a 2-year proposal, and you just want to review it at the end of 2020 and then give them another year? Or do you want this to just be a 1-year proposal and they're back to the drawing board?
Thank you. So my proposal is for it to be a one-year program which they can administer, understanding that they would begin fishing, I guess, in the spring, and then have another opportunity to fish in the fall until they reach 200 pounds in the calendar year of 2020. If I recall, when I made the motion, it had not, the original motion had not been clarified to include that there would be no fishing in November and December of this year. And so I don't think the motion changes that at all, even though it's now added. So next spring they would begin fishing, and they would have an opportunity, just like they do in Maine, to catch enough glass eels to begin that aquaculture program in 2020, even though it'll be in 2 waves. Or maybe they'll catch them all in the spring of next year. I have no idea what's going to happen. And then we would still have the opportunity to review it, and they could make another request for a continuance under that proposal. I'm concerned about a review of a 2-year plan that has a value on the street, never mind grown out, of something around $400,000. And when it starts to get to that number, I think people will argue about it. So rather than giving them an understanding that they would have a 2-year proposal, I feel more comfortable with a 1-year proposal.
Thank you, Senator. We have Chris Wright and then Cherie. And I'd remind everybody we're already over, so we'll try to go ahead and wrap this up quickly if we can.
So if there's going to be a review, would that happen at the winter meeting?
So thanks, Chris. This is Kirby. What you're asking is that because they won't be harvesting any eels later this fall, and their fishing season is kind of bifurcated on the beginning of 2020 and the end of 2020, that the report out on how the fishing year 2020 went would be in the winter meeting of 2021.
Right. So then they would have a chance to submit another proposal for the following 2021 year, correct?
I think that could be possible. I will point out that, that would be somewhat in the middle of their fishing season, so that's just something for the board to keep in mind, that if there is the interest in maintaining that for the 2021 fishing season, it would be, the end of, from February onward and then November through December, but it would be the board's discretion on how to specify it then if need be.
Right, and that might cause a problem, because then might foreclose their opportunity in 2021. And I think we should be clear that when we make this decision on this motion, that they have an opportunity to actually submit a proposal in early 2021 and to get it approved. I mean, it seems like you're foreclosing their opportunity for that second year.
Kirby? Senator Minor, can you clarify?
Sure. We're in August, and in August we found out what happened this spring. And it would seem to me that in the August meeting at the very latest next year, we could have an update. I would argue we could have an update in May. I think North Carolina will know how the spring fishing went. And so I don't think that would necessarily foreclose anything. I would certainly be willing to reconsider a motion in next May or next August, just as we are today, about another request for another year of fishing. I just think I would feel better having had that conversation by this time next year to provide that opportunity.
We have Cherie and then Chris, and hopefully we can wrap up.
Okay. The way that first sentence reads is we're approving the North Carolina's agriculture proposal. Oh, I'm sorry, it got changed to 2020 only. Sorry. The last sentence, if you go back to the original sentence, maybe then you can move the last sentence to say the board will be provided with an annual review to approve the second year?
Cherie, because the motion is property of the board, you would need to amend, we believe. So would you be willing to amend the existing motion? Tony, is that right? That's what I'm thinking?
Yeah, we were trying to take a shortcut. Yeah, I think we're getting too wrapped around the axle to have these guys be able to fish over a straddled year, a fishing year, as opposed to 2 calendar years. So it almost seems like we have to be nimble enough next year to be able to allow them to fish that second year without having to go through a whole different proposal.
All right, so we have a motion there. Any last comments or suggestions? Chris?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I understand and appreciate the board's concerns. Just with allowing these kind of activities with glass seals, and due to the how valuable they are, and just keeping track of them. But I kind of feel like this motion rewrites the plan significantly. They wanted to do a fishing year to where they're fishing continuously from November through March. I don't think they contemplated having a multi-month break between March and November in their fishing activity. And I think for all practical purposes, this motion would give them 3 months to fish, as Chris Wright indicated. We come back and report to the board the activities in May or August. Then I guess that would maybe let them start fishing again in November, assuming that they could go November to March. Or this plan to be approved for just a January through March fishing year, which is 2 months less than what they were doing in the previous plan. So I can't support the motion. I think it's ventured too far away from what the American Eel Farm proposed, what we thought would be workable. But anyways.
Maureen Davidson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In light of what Chris just said, that we're sort of taking away some of their had planned fishing, I would like to ask if it's possible, since the proposal from North Carolina expired May 30th, would we be able to have your new proposal start November 1st so that you would be able to fish November and December in 2019? And then the plan would include the fishing that would happen from January through March, and then we could decide what we would do with November 2020 through March of 2021. But at least for the first year, we could try and prevent them from losing November through December by just changing the date of when your proposal starts.
Chris, does that help you?
If I understand correctly, I mean, the proposal starts November right now for 2019 if the plan that we submitted was approved. So it already was November through March. So it was a 2-year plan, November 2019 to March 2020, and then November 2020 to March 2021. This motion would not allow the November part of that. It would really just, like I said, for all practical purposes, be January through March, unless I'm misunderstanding what you're asking.
So we're really trying our best to provide the flexibility that they're requesting, but finding it's an incredible challenge. So unless somebody can solve this and bust this riddle, we've got Adam and then Lynn. Please, let's see if we can get through this and move forward in one way, shape, or another form. Thanks.
So when I think of the time that we've put into this now and the potential that there was 600 pounds of glass eels over the last 3 years,
We're contemplating another 2 years. That's 1,000 pounds of glass eels. There's probably people out there in the audience thinking, wow, the economic value I could have provided with this if you'd given them to me instead. So clearly we're struggling with concerns about these proposals, about the way this company has conducted business. I would ask North Carolina at this point, if we move to postpone this decision today, do they think they could go back, discuss these concerns with the company, and perhaps bring another proposal back to us that we could take up at the annual meeting for 2020 and beyond? And that would be a way I'd look to move forward at this point.
Chris?
I guess either if the plant, if it was postponed, then we would talk to staff and then meet back up with the folks in the American Eel Farm and see what they want to do. I mean, I guess that's an option. Because I mean, I think the concerns expressed by the board are pretty clear. That at least what they propose just doesn't sit well with many. So if that's what the board wants to do, we can go back to the American Eel Farm and see if they want to put in something that maybe eases some concerns in time for the annual meeting.
If that's the pleasure of the board, we would need a motion to that extent. And Kirby, could you please clarify?
Yeah, just so the board is aware, the language in Addendum 4 says that aquaculture plans must be submitted by June 1st of the preceding fishing year, and approval must be determined by the board by September 1st.
Roy Miller.
Mr. Chairman, with the board's indulgence, I'd like to offer a substitute motion that I hope clears this matter up. Move to approve North Carolina's aquaculture proposal to harvest up to 200 pounds in the 2020 to 2021 fishing season, parentheses, November 1, 2020 to March 31st, 2021, end parentheses. Eels harvested will be grown out to the yellow eel stage, minimum size 9 inches. Thank you.
Wait to get that up.
Roy, can you just clarify again what the dates are in the fishing year?
All right. My colleagues say they want to start this November, so the dates would change to be 2019 to 2020 instead of 2020 to 2021, and it would start November 1st, 2019 to March 31st, 2020.
And we have a second by Pat Kelleher. Okay, we have a motion on the table. Is there a discussion? Brief one. Cherie Patterson.
Well, I'm just questioning whether that fits the addendum. That's my only concern, is the addendum indicates calendar year, I believe, and now it's changing to fishing year? No?
No, as I mentioned earlier in my presentation, it doesn't specify calendar year. It speaks to annually.
Go with Ray Kane, then Emerson Hasbrook, then Chris.
So we have the understanding that North Carolina will be able to come back to us a year from now at the August meeting with a report on their November 1, 19 to March 31st, 2020, right?
Ray, I'm sorry, you just say one more time, by what point in time were you saying the report come back?
This time next year.
Okay. Okay, confirmed. So we'll go to Emerson Hasbrook.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have no problems with the substitute motion. But my concern goes back to an issue I raised, I don't know how long ago, half an hour ago, and maybe I'm the only one who's concerned here. But we say here, we said it with Maine, that they will be grown out to the yellow eel life stage. So what happens if there's a mortality event, total or partial, and they're not grown out to that life stage? That's the first part of my question. The second part is, did anybody in North Carolina verify that there was a complete die-off and those 13.8 pounds or whatever it was did in fact die?
I thought Chris had mentioned law enforcement did verify that mortality event. Chris Wright?
My question was answered in the previous one.
Roy Miller?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to just clean up the motion a little bit. On the second line, I would insert the word "for" between proposal and "up." So it reads proposal for up to 200 pounds for, and strike the second "the" there, for 2019 to 2020. I think that cleans it up. Thank you.
Acceptable to the seconder, Pat? Any further discussion? Pat?
Mr. Chairman, I just want the record to reflect that this board does have the ability to revisit this after we report back next year and change our mind in regards to the second year if needed.
Kirby's confirming.
Just to clarify, Pat, that the motion currently on the board is only for a one-year proposal.
Adam Nowalski.
Where does this motion leave the TC recommendations?
Kirby?
So I guess the question is really to the makers of the motion. If you want to make it clear on the record that your motion is encompassing that, then we can make sure that language is in this. But if you want to just speak to it and make sure that it's inclusive of technical committee recommendations, I think this board has discussed this enough to clarify that is of interest to this board.
Roy, do you want to add that language?
Yeah, we could add that language.
Consistent with the technical committee's recommendations?
Yes.
All right, we're going to go ahead and call the question. Go ahead and read the motion and move to substitute to approve North Carolina's aquaculture proposal for up to 200 pounds for 2019-2020, November 1st, 2019 to March 31st, 2020, consistent with the technical committee's recommendations. Eels harvested will be grown out to the yellow eel life stage, minimum 9 inches. Motion by Mr. Miller, second by Mr. Kelleher. All those in favor, please raise your hand. Opposed? Abstentions? Null votes. Motion passes 1601. Thank you all. We've run over, but is there any other business to bring before?
Sorry,
No,
this
sir.
is the main motion.
My. We're all looking to make sure it gets done. Okay. All right, is there any objection to the main motion? Seeing none, it passes by consent. All right. Is there any other business to bring before the board? Seeing none, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you all for your
Before everybody goes
information.
away really quick, I just want to introduce Dustin Colson-Leaning. He's here at the front of the table. He's the Commission's newest staff member. He is working on summer flounder, scup, bluefish, winter flounder, and northern shrimp. If you get a chance just to come say hello this week and welcome to the Commission family. He started in July, but this is his first full week of Commission meeting week fun. And this was a great meeting to introduce him to motion taking. Thank you. We will start the horseshoe crab board in as quickly as possible, but maybe about 7 minutes, hopefully at 3 o'clock.